So my apologies for my computer crashing at the end of the lecture this week. This was just to finish off the last 5 minutes that I was planning to discuss with you. So we've been talking about Antigone not as an enlightened heroine who embodies everything that is good and true and moral, but rather that within Greek terms, within Athenian 5th century terms, her behavior is highly transgressive. It is, if you like, a negative paradigm of female behavior. And her decision to put her brother and her family above the polis is problematic on all sorts of levels. That she has the autonomy to choose the oikos and the philoi, that is her household and her family, over the polis, the state. And in a situation such as Athens found itself in the 5th century, where they're in war with Sparta and virtually all of the Peloponnese, you can see that that decision to put family above state, to put one's own morality above patriotism, is highly, highly problematic, if not transgressive, if not dangerous. So, as I was saying, in the 2015 production of Antigone at Malthouse, which I had been asked to adapt, we had several problems. The first is only a cast of 5, when ideally we would have had 22. The second is that for between 6 and 8 months of trying to cast the play, we could not find a male creon of the right, what we say, industry stature to take the role. They were all busy. So the director and I were having a chat one day and lamenting that we couldn't actually change the gender and have a female creon. As anyone in the business will know, there is a great dearth of decent parts for women once they passed 40. We decided that we couldn't do this, obviously, because of the implicit Hegelian dialectic between the male and the female, which is so integral to the play. But then, as we thought about it, that started to become almost obsolete, because our ideas of gender have changed since Hegel. They're no longer the black and white of male versus female. There are many, many shades of grey, many nuances, many variegations. And as I said at the end of the lecture that was recorded, thinking about the women such as Angela Merkel, Julia Gillard, Theresa May, and Maggie Thatcher, let alone the way Hillary Clinton was treated in the Trump campaign against her, we see that the strong, powerful, middle-aged woman actually is every bit as potentially transgressive as the young, virginal, potentially idealistic image of Antigone. So, by having a female creon up against Antigone, we actually see an elaboration of gender performativity in a way that one could say is much more nuanced and potentially sophisticated in our contemporary world than having the black and white of a misogynistic creon versus an idealistic, ideal Antigone, such as Lord Frederick Leighton and Hegel himself considered her to be. Now, the response to the production of Antigone was extraordinarily contentious. It was without doubt the most contentious production in Melbourne of that year, and potentially in Australia in that year. And if you've had a chance to look at the chapter from Classical Antiquities, Classics Down Under, which I uploaded at the bottom of this page, you'll get some idea of quite how contentious this was. But I want to finish with a quotation that came from the only female reviewer who hated the production. Now, remember that the critical divide was absolutely gendered based, with the one exception of this review. So all the men hated it, all the women loved it, or at least were impressed by it on some level. But then there was this extraordinary review by Carol Dwyer, who absolutely loathed the production. First of all, let's analyze this. Sophocles' original, and that's sick, there is no apostrophe on Sophocles in her writing. Sophocles' original may have been the first feminist manifesto. Well, first of all, let's think about the baggage that we've discussed, about calling something that Sophocles wrote 2,500 years ago a feminist manifesto. What does that actually mean within the terms of ancient Athens, particularly given the position of women that we've discussed? Antigone prepared to go against all tradition and any obstacle for her rights. Well, we see some parallels there with Bernard Knox, but against all tradition Now, that is something that is clearly antithetical to the text that we have of Sophocles, since Antigone is claiming that her understanding of the rules of burial, of the moral rules of the Olympian cosmos, are tradition, and that Creon is working against them. Misogynistic Creon, afraid of letting a woman wield any power. Well, there is certainly a raft of anti-female sentiment in Antigone, which Creon lays against womankind and Antigone in particular. And yet to say misogynistic is pretty loaded in terms of analysing a 5th century text, because Creon, one could argue, is simply spouting the line that most Athenian men would have had about their women, i.e. women remain indoors, women do not do, women are pliant to men, women are subordinate, because they are not men, they are not part of the polis. Now, when this goes on to say making the gender switch that we have instead is the abstract theme of power, politics versus humanity, there I would suggest we get to the very core of what Sophocles is talking about, that the polis, the political, is set against an autonomous idea of the family. And that, in many ways, is more crucial than a feminist dialectic or a female dialectic. So I want us to leave this with this final comment that there's also a rather nasty sense of how women, rather than supporting each other, are prepared to backstab those closest to them to get what they want. Creon says it's not personal, it's just politics. The writer missing the point that if Creon is a female, then it should be personal, at least on a subtextual level. So let's end this lecture by thinking about that. If a woman is in charge, it must, by default, her thoughts must, by default, her political ambitions and actions, by default, must be based on personal feelings rather than a political, intellectual sensibility. So here in the 20th century, 21st century, in 2015, we have a female critic who, by her, if one were to read the comments after the posted after the passage that I wrote, which I describe in that chapter, if one to read those, she actually claims that she was one of the first second wave feminists in Australian broadcast culture, writing for Prisoner Cell Block H. Well, that's really fascinating, because with that background, she is still considering that the woman must be personal, not political. And so when I've asked, how do we make Greek theatre, Greek tragedy, and this play relevant for us, I'd like you to think about that point. While there are still people who believe, while there are still avowed feminists who believe that for women, we must prioritize the personal over the political, is not gender still a crucial, controversial, potentially problematic, and non-paradigmatic element in our society? That a woman, her performativity of gender is supposed to be one way, and that the woman who goes against that, the woman who is of the polis, or indeed is above the polis, is infinitely more transgressive than somebody who conforms to a performative idea of, as Hegel and Frederick Leighton found, the ideal virgin, such as Antigone. So think about that, because it's interesting, isn't it, that this version of Antigone with a female Creon was infinitely more controversial than a production with a male Creon could possibly have been. Gender is still very, very prominent in our consciousness and also our subconsciousness. Okay, so I hope that you have enjoyed these 3 lectures on Greek drama and that you have a great time with the rest of the unit. If you have any questions, any comments, don't forget to contact me on jane.griffiths@monash.edu, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Have a great rest of semester. Bye-bye.